into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
All right, important discussion before we get started today. What happened to this ooey gooey gummy cake butter cake cake thing?
Okay, so I have a friend visiting town from St. Louis. I said, Anders, is there anything you want him to bring? Anders said, ooey gooey butter cake,
which is a staple of
St. Louis.
Yeah.
I tweeted this. Not tweeted this. I texted this as a joke to the friend. He then brought butter cake from St. Louis. I brought the butter cake to the podcast.
Not just any butter cake, gooey butter cake.
Ooey gooey butter cake. Ooh,
Did I add a bunch of shit? It's like gooey butter cake is what it's called?
Monkey bun.
Monkey bun?
When I was in St. Louis and I was 17 and I heard about this, I think I accidentally called it monkey cake when I ordered it.
That sounds horrible to say out loud.
The barista was like, yeah, we got it.
Yeah, don't say that. Don't say that word. So I'm holding the big tray of ooey gooey butter cake.
I think it's just gooey butter cake.
Yeah, it is just gooey butter cake.
Well, it's also ooey. And I'm outside Jake's apartment, and I'm holding 2 cups and a tray of gooey butter cake, and I'm pressing the door code, and the whole cake falls out of my hands, clip-clop, onto the ground, top of the cake first, onto the glue factory cement outside of the apartment.
Oh, no. Was it because I asked you to get me a pumpkin latte?
I should have used a drink tray. Yeah, I did too much.
My Catholicism has been activated. This is my fault now.
Well, in a way, I was suffering directly for that. So, yeah, it's got, like, chunks of asphalt in it, but I do really want to try it. And now I'm wondering, like, if we spoon the bottom, if that would be... It's right there. You don't need to show me pictures.
Yeah,
it's 5 feet away from us.
Also, yeah, we do this every podcast. They can't see the pictures.
Just trust me, listener. I'm looking at a gooey butter cake, and it's full of paint chips.
Apparently, it is... It was made by mistake, and it is occasionally known as ooey gooey butter cake.
It's a Powerpuff Girls style dessert.
Or chess cake.
Yeah.
Chess cake.
But
checkmate.
Your move, liberals.
Some German-American baker made it on accident. They were trying to make regular cake batter, according to Wikipedia, but reversed the proportions of butter and flour.
Accidentally came in the cake batter.
Perhaps.
There he was, fucking his cakes, as he does every week.
Oops.
Okay. So it became a thing, and they would put it as like an adhesive on Danish rolls and shit, and then it became its own cake. And if you go there,
what is this thing even going to taste like?
This is regional to St. Louis.
Yes, and the trouble with it is you look at it and you expect it to have a lemon flavor.
I do.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's buttery.
All right, I am going to eat from the bottom of the cake once we get off here.
Yeah.
I didn't
take
that's
my
happening.
Lactaid before, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to eat it, but I'll take some home.
Jeremy brought that to you from Missouri.
I'll take some home.
You have a debt to pay.
You dropped it face down on...
That's why we're going to have a spoonful of the bottom.
So we got to just somehow separate the top. But the top looks like the best part.
Just don't go to the top. Just do it from the bottom. It does look like the best part.
All of the top was touched by the ground?
It looks fine to me.
It fell head top down onto the paper outside.
It's kind of concave, so only the rim would have touched the concrete,
If you're going to have some, just don't touch the rim. We have a really smart guest for you today, guys. You're going to love this episode.
Real quick, they say 5-second rule. I've read that it's more like a 30 to 40-second rule because it takes a while for the germs to gather.
And we keep saying this, it doesn't count if there's asphalt chunks in the top of the cake.
New York City,
is that
the
what
rules.
That is? I thought it was sugar.
It's like 1 second in New York. But also, this is very I did my own vaccine research logic.
Hey, it was on NPR.
Yeah, we're gonna need.
They've never lied to us.
You're gonna need a booster after eating this thing. Good Lord.
They're health freaks.
Actually, this cake makes you immune to COVID.
Honestly, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bivalent cake strain.
Yeah.
You don't need vaccines. Just take gooey butter cake that's been on the New York City ground.
That's right. You heard it from us. The fact that you just said that means when people download this podcast, it's going to come with a big fucking thing that says like disinformation waiver. You cannot vaccinate yourself with a cake. Yeah.
It's Pod Damn America for another week.
Let me intro our guest. I should just begin by saying we're talking about the deep state, and all our little pedants and wonks are going to want a little definition before we dive in.
It's like a deep cake.
Right. It's a deep cake.
Gooey state.
You got the top of the cake, which is Congress.
Which is ooey.
Yeah, and the governments and the elected officials. And then below that, you got what really makes the cake a cake, and that is a loose, clandestine network of intelligence, military, and business officials and people.
More butter than flour, where the flour is a good structure and the butter is corruption.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the base of the cake. That's the what's the word? The crust.
Yeah, the superstructure of the cake.
That's what makes it function. You know.
I hope this cleared up everything for you at home.
Yeah.
This is Marx. He said this is how he described.
No, it's just for all
Society
the people who are like
is a cake.
He's Der Kaken from his famous book Der Kaken.
He was German, and so was the maker of gooey butter cake.
I'll allow you to draw conclusions at home.
All right, let's go to the interview with Mr. Professor Aaron Good. All right, we are now joined by Aaron Good, who is the author of American Exception, Empire and the Deep State, as well as the host of a podcast of the same name. Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Yes, and this book has been out for a little while now. It was, I think, originally a dissertation of yours. You are in the world of academe, and I'm really curious how this has been received among your colleagues, because this is about the deep state, parapolitics. These are topics that academia has been even sort of the left wing of academia has been really loath to dive into. How has it been received by the scholastic world?
Well, it's funny that you say that because it's very far out of the mainstream of political science. But I was able to put together a dissertation committee that included and a prospectus committee that had 4 guys from the Temple University Political Science Department, and then a sociology professor from Sonoma State, Peter Phillips, and a history teacher from American University, Peter Kuznick. And then Lance DeHaven Smith of Florida State was on the prospectus committee, and then he fell ill. He had to get out of there. But there are more people in political science that secretly probably agree with me than you might guess. And other people in other disciplines, like some academic historians. One guy who wrote a really good book, probably the best book on the coup in Iraq in 1963, which is one of the lesser known events in the history of covert operations. He contacted me and was telling me how much he appreciated the book and its take on oil politics, which was cool to me because here's a specialist. And then there's going to be a couple reviews, at least one review in an academic journal that I know of. And then another sort of blob think tank requested a review copy of the book, but I'd be real surprised if they wrote anything on it. I don't even think they would want to diss it because it's like they would rather just pretend it doesn't exist. But I think that there are more people who actually think who see that the American empire is basically a fraud and that much of the things I say are accurate. And if you listen to people like Jeffrey Sachs lately, he almost sounds, when he talks about the U.S. empire and the lawlessness of it all, it almost sounds like he's doing like a kind of slightly, kinder, gentler summary of my book. So I think the criminality of the whole U.S. empire is just kind of becoming more and more obvious to people. But as a result of that, the regime is kind of more, crazy about stamping that out, perhaps in a bigger sense. And so we get all these NAFO and yada, yada, all this other propaganda stuff. But in general, nobody's really written a detailed criticism of the book that tries to refute its main points, which to me is pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, it's a really great book. I recommend everyone check it out, and especially because it's taking sort of a political science angle on the history of the deep state, which is I think pretty unique, and it's very historical. You start sort of in the World War II era with the rise of the deep state. But I want to ask, American Empire, I think we would agree, somewhat predates what we would call the deep state. How would you characterize the antecedents to the deep state with American empire, and what were sort of the structural incentives for the intelligence apparatus to arise?
Well, this is a case where it was circumstances actually kind of helped me to get more insight into this, because political science is a discipline that's notoriously ahistorical, meaning that they just do not have a good way of incorporating history. They like to reduce everything to a set of variables that you can plug in and then make some sort of findings about it and formulate theories that way. And so there's not a lot of history that's a part of the curriculum exactly. But I was teaching history to help pay the bills and such at a high school while I was working on my dissertation. And I taught U.S. history for several years. And it made me go back and look at early parts of U.S. history and think about it in ways I hadn't. I also taught similar courses at Temple University as a graduate student when I was working on the PhD. So these things were good because my expertise is really post-World War II, the intelligence agencies, the post-World War II U.S. empire, and so on, and the national security state. But going back and looking at the U.S. from the very beginning and starting to study these issues that led to the English colonialism in America, it all seems of a piece related to capitalism. I mean, in England, this is a very simplified version, but I think I'm going to hit some main points here. In England, you had feudalism, for quite a while, and eventually you get the enclosure movement, which where they start taking the commons and walling it off for sheep in order to support England's textile industry, which is the real first industry in England, and it basically gives rise to modern capitalism. And as a result, you have a pressure on the population because they're being pushed off the land. And also the landed estates, they only can pass on their lands to the firstborn. So you have these like lesser born sons that have to go and strike it out somewhere. So a lot of them go to the New World, and they go to Virginia first. And the people that go to Virginia are the Virginia Company. It's not a Christian crusade or anything like that. It's a business venture. And they grow tobacco, and they start importing slaves when that gets too expensive because of the white indentured servitude labor. And they want to keep pushing west. They fight a revolution in part in order to be allowed to keep going west and to keep enslaving people, which Britain was against both of those things eventually. So a big part of the U.S. Western expansion and the Revolutionary War is capitalism and the pressures that it put to go out and colonize, and then these business ventures you set up over there, and then the colonists have incentives to keep going west and killing more Indians, and so on. So they go see the shining sea. They steal land from the Mexicans with the Mexican-American War, and as soon as they do that, by the time they do that in the 1850s, that's consolidated. They take a boat right into Tokyo Bay, and they say, "You guys are going to trade with us." Okay, so they basically have the idea that once they see the shining sea, that they're going to go and start going into the Pacific and make a lot of money there, because they know about the opium wars. They know about how much money got made there. And a lot of the Americans in the Northeast, the early industrialists, they made their money on the opium trade. So there was this pressure to go into the Pacific, really ramps up with the Spanish-American War. Once basically the U.S. goes from sea to shining sea and the frontier is closed by the 1890s, then it's a question of, do you want to develop America's domestic economy and the markets here and boost living standards, or do you want to go for imperialism? They fight the Spanish-American War, they go for imperialism. But America's still somewhat isolationist in its sentiment, not wanting to be an overseas empire like the Brits. That's kind of how they identify themselves. And so they enter World War I, in part to help J.P. Morgan be sure to be able to collect all the money they'd loaned to the Brits. And then they kind of set the stage for World War II with the way that they left the settlement with Germany. And the key is with World War II, you had the elites in the United States make a decision that this is Wall Street, basically, right? The Council on Foreign Relations, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, all this money, they get sanctioned from the FDR administration to plan U.S. entry into the war and the post-war empire. And that's what they do. It's been a top-down affair from the very beginning. The richest people in the United States, they looked at what was happening in World War II, and they said, we're going to enter this war, and we're eventually going to win because we're the most powerful industrial center in the world, and so on. And then we need to actually be the hegemon of the global capitalist system that's going to emerge. And that's what they did. So it was always an empire. The U.S. was always imperialist, but it was continental. until you get later into the 1800s. And then it's a question of, okay, are we going to build a prosperous country here alone and not be imperial? Or are we going to practice, international imperialism when they do the banana republics and so on? And they go into East Asia, they take over the Philippines. But it's really only after World War II that the US just goes right for it. And they drop bombs on Japan, basically just to show the Soviets that they were in charge. That was totally gratuitous at the end of World War II. And the next year, 1946, they're threatening the Soviets themselves, their supposed allies, that they're going to drop a nuke on them if they don't get out of Iran, okay, which is not America's backyard. So it starts it's always an empire in the U.S. And with World War II, they decided, hey, we're going to be the global empire, and it's going to be great. It's going to be the American century, not a century of the common man, like Vice President Henry Wallace wanted. It was just going to be all empire. And we're seeing that up to this day kind of finally starting to unravel. But it's been a long, almost 80 years process.
Wow, it's fun watching it all in fast motion like that.
Yeah, we'll have to get an animator, put that on YouTube. But yeah, the World War II, I think, is a really fascinating time domestically in the United States, particularly the end of the war, 1944. You mentioned Henry Wallace, who I kind of see as one of two wolves, if you will, in the United States, in the Democratic Party, in Franklin Roosevelt himself. He had his last two vice presidents, Wallace and Truman. Of course, Wallace was like booted off the ticket in 1944 by the party establishment. But what did he represent that was such a threat to at the time, the inchoate deep state? And what kind of path perhaps would he have charted had he been allowed to stay on as Roosevelt's successor?
Well, he is the most notable New Dealer, perhaps. He was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he saved U.S. agriculture by taking unconventional steps like slaughtering a whole lot of baby pigs because there were extra amounts, and they donated the pork to poor people, and paying farmers not to grow crops to prop up crop prices. And he commented on how that the whole catastrophe was a result of a criminal lack of statesmanship leading up to the Great Depression. And he wanted to essentially copy some of the good things that the Soviets had. His idea was that the U.S. would copy things like the healthcare systems and educational systems and full employment of the Soviet Union. And then hopefully the Soviet Union would copy, free speech and other freedoms that we have in the United States, and that the countries could peacefully compete with each other. This was a direct contrast to what Henry Luce was advocating. Henry Luce was the publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune magazine, and he was part of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he basically pitched the plan for empire in Life magazine in his essay, An American Century or The American Century. He's was putting it out there as like his plan for the CFR's plan for like global free enterprise and shared prosperity under American, auspices. Of course, prosperity wouldn't be that shared, but that's beside the point. Now, Henry Wallace was on the other. He was the vice president, and he was probably more in line with what FDR wanted. And he gave a speech called The Century of the Common Man. And he was calling for just the opposite. He was saying the U.S. should have some global leadership role, but it should be because we have all of this technology and all of this industrial capacity, and that we should use our power to uplift humanity and allow countries to have better access to the fruits of human technology and to uplift themselves according to however they best want to plan and organize their economies. And we can let this be a fair competition and peaceful competition among countries. And then hopefully this will usher in a new age of abundance and security for mankind. That was what Wallace wanted. That's not what we get. We get the U.S. empire. And this was Wallace had to go. It seems now overdetermined. I think if they hadn't have gotten in at this point, after seeing the way that they operate and function and the amount of resources they had behind them, I think that if Wallace had somehow won, they likely would have killed him, because this is just what they do. I mean, the next statesman who comes along with a similar, even though he doesn't state it outright, but the next person who comes along sort of advocating this kind of world order and wanting to not have the Cold War is JFK, and they get rid of him. So I see Wallace as being, even more straightforwardly advocating that, and that's what they did. They had to get rid of him.
And the guy they replaced him with, of course, is the other wolf, Harry S. Truman, who becomes president and helps establish the post-war global order. What was his role in doing that? I mean, he's an interesting figure for a lot of reasons, but one is because, he's instrumental in the birth of the CIA, but later in life says that we've gotten some mission creep. The CIA has gotten out of control. He comes to at least somewhat publicly regret his role in creating the deep state. What was his trajectory like? And I'm also curious, you mentioned Wall Street, of course. There's Sullivan and Cromwell, which is a really instrumental firm in all this stuff. I think both the Dulles brothers worked there. And after World War II, how do they get amnesty? Because they worked hand in hand with the Nazis. Was Truman at all interested in prosecuting them? What was his sort of thinking like in that period and leading up to the end of his life?
Yeah, after World War II, there's something of a political battle between people who had been basically trading with the enemy, like the Dulles brothers and Thomas McKittrick, who ran the Bank for International Settlements. There's a lot of reason to believe that FDR wanted to prosecute McKittrick especially. And these are people very connected to the Dulles brothers. And the Dulles brothers it was Allen Dulles who was the vice president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He would later become president right after World War II. But Allen Dulles was one of the main people behind the actual study that planned out the U.S. empire. He also was the author of 2 still classified parts of the War and Peace Studies Project, which was the planning for the U.S. empire. And his sections were on security and sovereignty. And Peter Dale Scott and others think that probably those reports called for something like the creation of a CIA, because he was a OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. He was an OSS guy and kind of an oil intelligence guy. And so probably he had already planned out the need for something like a CIA to run this world order. Now, Harry Truman's role in this is mostly that he was just a guy who was corruptible, but without seeming so. He'd been able to be successful as a guy who was brought up by the Kansas City political machine, the Pendergast machine, who was just one of those mobbed up party boss guys, and who later went to jail. But Truman was basically plucked from obscurity. He was a failed haberdasher and really wasn't doing much of anything. And then he became a judge and then eventually senator. And then later he hooks up with the St. Louis machine later on in his career. And he had just become a guy who had gotten some sort of good reputation for in leading a investigation into war profiteering. And he seemed like a folksy, straight shooter of a kind of a guy. And he was picked mostly because he was a guy who owed his success to other powerful people. And so he's co-optable. And that's why they pick him. It's hard you can't really blame Truman. I mean, you can, but in reality, it's like the system picked the man, and that's why they picked him. So you really want to understand why they picked him. And even he had some conscience. Like, he didn't want to overthrow Mossadegh. It wasn't until Eisenhower was elected that got approved. He talked about the FBI as a Gestapo at some points. He talked about the CIA as a Gestapo later. But there's no getting around the fact he creates the CIA. He nukes 2 Japanese cities. He sets off this arm race. He's there to allow them to threaten to nuke the Soviets in 1946. He's just a guy who, when it came down to it, could be pressured by these more powerful forces. And that's going to be his legacy, I think, and how he's remembered. The guy in the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves, described his decision on the bomb as not one of basically getting out of the way. He said he was like a little boy on a toboggan. And that's pretty much how it was. He just said, okay. And then that's how it happens. And then he acts all excited about it after the fact. But it was other people. But that was basically his career. He did what he was told.
Yeah, well, there's a really funny scene in Devil's Chessboard where in his post-presidency, he's, as you said, finally getting excited about the CIA and all their misadventures and claiming, oh, that's not what we intended. And Allen Dulles comes and pays him a visit and tries to get him to recant this article he's written. And Truman doesn't. He says, no, I stand by it. And then Dulles tells the media, oh, yeah, he's confused. He's just a crazy old ex-president now. He doesn't know what's going on. And he privately apologized to me, which was a lie. But it's just funny how much these guys are able to manipulate just even the words of former presidency of the United States
Yeah, Alan Dulles was like, it's 1960, so he's over 50 years old, which means he's 100. He's mad now.
Yeah.
It's funny how much people just think the president is the one doing all this stuff.
Right.
They have the nicest suit.
Yeah, with the face, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point because, you know, of course, after Truman, there's Eisenhower, and, you know, it's interesting because, you know, in 48, Dulles' man was Dewey, and he was disappointed that Truman won, but, you know, he was not as much of a threat to the establishment as, you know, someone like Wallace was, so they weren't going to really do anything serious about that. But then they get their guy in Eisenhower in a lot of respects, and, you know, as you write, that's kind of the 50s is sort of the consolidation of the deep state, and something that I was not aware of, which you write about in the book, Operation Doomsday, which is a very fascinating phenomenon. What can you tell us about Operation Doomsday?
Super villain thing.
Yeah, this gets into what Peter Dale Scott calls the deep events in U.S. history, which are these very controversial episodes that go on to alter the trajectory of U.S. history and shape the structure of the government as well. They have an institutional impact on the U.S. government. And the Doomsday Project factors into these in weird ways. So I'll explain a deep event. A deep event would be like Watergate, or a structural deep event, especially. These are the more serious ones, like Watergate, the JFK assassination, 9/11. He describes this, Iran-Contra. And the Doomsday Project figures in all of these. It gets invented it gets established really in the early days of the Cold War. As soon as there's a nuclear weapon in the early years, they're saying, like, we need to make sure that there's no kind of decapitation strike. So we need a communication network that's going to be reliable no matter what. And along with that, there are other provisions to these arrangements that are just not known to this day. They're still kept under great secrecy. Presidents take over and they don't necessarily understand them. So under Truman and Eisenhower, especially under Eisenhower, they create a board of people who are mostly private citizens who would be there to intervene and take control of the government in the event of some kind of catastrophic emergency. And it's difficult for Kennedy to even figure out, and for George Bundy to even understand what these proposals are. It's like it takes them quite a while into the administration to even start to understand these. And it's quite possible that these institutions, not only is there this sort of military and intelligence controlled communications network, but they may have authorization to do other emergency acts because they are charged with the existential security of the state. And so some of these elements may be in charge of sort of saying when it's an emergency to begin with. Like, you have to determine what's an emergency. Initially, it's only for nuclear issues, but this gets broadened. And as is usually the case, we actually don't know what kind of powers these entities have. But they figure a little bit in the JFK assassination. Like, there are communications networks that are referred to by certain parts of the government that it's never been released to the public or explained, like the White House Communications Network. Boasts about, like, helping to chronicle the events in Dallas on, November 22nd, 1963, but nobody's ever actually heard those. That's one thing Peter Dale Scott found. In Watergate, James McCord seems to have been working on continuity of government, which is another name for the Doomsday Project. These kind of measures, which would round up dissidents and enact a censorship regime, basically, in the event of some kind of emergency in the United States. So they were laying all this kind of groundwork for it. And what's alarming about this, in part, is that somebody like James McCord, who figures in Watergate, he's one of the burglars, but also in the Kennedy assassination. He also covers up the Frank Olson assassination in 1953, where a CIA officer had been dosed with acid and later tossed out of a window, apparently, because he was deemed a security risk. And so the continuity of government, doomsday operations, the communications network, it's also used in Iran-Contra, like Oliver North uses it in Iran-Contra. In the 90s, Rumsfeld and Cheney are working, even though they're not supposedly in government, they're in the private sector. They're actually working all throughout the 90s on updates to this. And then it just so happens on 9/11, they basically activate all of these certain powers and functions of COG doomsday network on the day of 9/11, and we don't know what communications were passed over that way. So this is a whole element of the government that's very secret. But when you talk about like the ability of the state to like intervene in some really overriding way, and to keep that secret from us indefinitely, COG and the Doomsday Project seem to be major mysteries of really the deep history of the United States.
So there's a possibility that COG, continuity of government, that's I don't know, on the books, or on the secret books that most people don't know about. There's like a possibility that
it gets activated every year. Every year, the state of emergency gets renewed since 9/11. So there are still provisions active, and we're not even allowed to know what they are.
Wow. There's a possibility that like there's enough of a crisis of legitimacy, we could just have like a president or dictator, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. That'll be totally like legal.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at some of the things that they've done, look at the Frank Olson assassination. If you watch Wormwood, you can glean that the in all likelihood the reason Olson was assassinated is that he was going to reveal that the U.S. was using bioweapons in Korea. So why is he assassinated? Because it would have been a horrible embarrassment for the U.S. to have that exposed, and so you can kill someone. Well, if that's what the government is authorized to do, to kill people from exposing embarrassing crimes in 1953. Then we need to take that into account, that the government has asserted that prerogative power. And what does that mean? It means almost anything could be authorized that's logical, and we wouldn't ever have any reason to think that we'd know about it.
Well, that leads me to my next question is perhaps was there a COG authorization involved in the Kennedy assassination? And more broadly, can you speak of the significance of JFK and why the deep state may have wanted him gone, and what you think the strongest evidence for a conspiracy is?
Well, the JFK assassination is really fascinating, and it's worth deep study because it touches on so many elements of the history of the deep state that it's really a great gateway to start learning about the power structure of this country. Kennedy takes office, and his administration is kind of schizophrenic, in part because he has so many Rockefeller people running things. A lot of the people from his administration had been in the Rockefeller study group that was part of a exploratory venture for Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. When Kennedy wins, he basically has faith in the establishment, and he calls his friend Robert Lovett, who was a CIA OSS guy in the early days, like OSS, but very establishment guy. And he says, "Would you like to be my Secretary of State or something?" He says, No, but let me tell you who to put in. And he basically gives him all these Rockefeller guys to put in, like Dean Rusk, Henry Kissinger, down lower level, but Douglas Dillon, who's part of the Dillon Reed Wall Street family. All kinds of people, like Robert McNamara is one of these people, McGeorge Bundy. Like his administration is like Rockefeller, and that's the Council on Foreign Relations. That's the people who plan the U.S. empire. These are people who have a view of the U.S. as being an empire for the benefit of corporate America. They don't package it that way. Kennedy doesn't necessarily perceive that it's that straightforward, but I think he comes to. And he runs as a Cold Warrior, and he is not a communist. He's anti-communist, but not a fanatic about it. But he also resists the pressure to go into war in Cuba, Bay of Pigs. They basically set him up for that. He really outrages them by not pulling the trigger on the U.S. intervention. And he refuses to send troops into Laos when the military brass asked him to. He refused to send troops or escalate in Berlin when he was asked to. Cuba, again, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in Vietnam, he would never send in ground troops. And he used the balance of payments issue as a part of why he wouldn't do it. He was saying this is going to wreck U.S. finances. So this also gets into another issue of Kennedy. Kennedy was trying to control that. Johnson exploded it. Okay, Johnson reverses Kennedy's policy in Indonesia, which allows the world's biggest gold mine to fall into the lap of Rockefeller's Freeport Sulfur Company. Once Kennedy is out of the way and Sukarno is out of the way, and they have to kill not just John Kennedy, but like 1, 2, 3 million Indonesians are massacred in the process of this. You get the Vietnam War. The policy is reversed days after Kennedy's assassination. The evidence of Kennedy's withdrawal is overwhelming at this point, I believe. I think that if you look at that, there's an October 2 memo from Maxwell Taylor saying all planning is to be geared towards the recommendations of the Taylor McNamara report, which means all personnel, everything is going to be geared towards a gradual withdrawal to be completed by the end of 1965. We'll be done with the training by then. We'll be able to get out. Johnson reverses that. So there's a lot of evidence of it. There's a lot of reason why foreign policy is the reason that Kennedy gets killed. Most obviously, he wanted to end the Cold War. That's why when he gets killed, Khrushchev is very sad. Nasser is devastated. Fidel Castro is very unhappy. Sukarno believes that it was because of his Indonesia policy that he got assassinated. Kwame Nkrumah thinks that the Warren Commission is a whitewash. Pretty much only Western and Europeans all think it's this plot. It's really only in the United States that people, and even then it's not even the public. It's more politicians and and public intellectuals who believe the Warren report. It's the public doesn't believe it. The evidence of a plot to kill King is overwhelming. I mean, there's the tape of him showing him pretty clearly getting shot from the front. There's all these reports of a blowout in the back of his head indicating a shot from the front from doctors and nurses and Secret Service people behind Kennedy who got hit with ejected brain matter so hard that they thought they got hit with a bullet. There's the impossible path of the magic bullet and the condition that it was found in and the problems with the chain of custody for it. There's Oswald being a supposed communist, but yet he's working out of a right-wing anti-communist FBI guy who heads the Caribbean Anti-Communist League. I mean, nothing and there's Jack Ruby, who's like a concerned local pimp who comes in and kills Oswald in a room full of cops. Oswald says, "I'm a patsy." Later on camera, Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, says, "Powerful people put me in this position, and I can't really talk about it. My life's in danger." I mean, it's the evidence of a plot there is overwhelming. And LBJ and Nixon and RFK, they all believed it was a plot and that the CIA was somehow involved. And nobody can do anything about it. They cover it up. But the evidence of a plot there is overwhelming. And what it shows is that it shows on top of other things that the empire is really in charge, and that their control over the media and the political machinery of the country is such that it's basically a totalitarian system with a democratic facade. And if you didn't believe it just with the JFK assassination, just consider that RFK wanted to reinvestigate his assassination, and then he gets killed also under very dubious circumstances. And that's where you see the deep state, the hand of the deep state, the hand of this empire, which is, and the stakes, the motives are to rule the world. The U.S. is the world's biggest empire, and you can't really maintain the world history's most dangerous empire by following laws and respecting democracy. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty obvious, but they put a lot of effort into not allowing us to recognize that.
Right, and as listeners know, I debated, and you as well, debated Bob Bazanko on this question, and one of the refrains conspiracy skeptics always go back to is that, it would have come out by now. People would have, there would have had to been thousands of people who had known the truth if it was real, and they would have said something by now. What's your response to that?
I mean, Dan Ellsberg gives a great explanation of this. He says that there are loads and loads of conspiracies in Washington that are very, very explosive and that never get out because of the people that are charged with keeping secrets are good at keeping secrets. That's one of their main things. Okay, Frank Olson was just straight up murdered because he was considered somebody who couldn't keep secrets. And what does that tell you? They've never really admitted exactly what happened. It's only sort of dribbled out. I think normally they don't even leave the fingerprints like they did with the Olson case. But we know that they can keep secrets. Ellsberg is one of the few people to leave these sort of circles and come out and tell us about this. It's funny because Ellsberg actually endorsed one of the best JFK assassination books. And he also said that JFK was pulling out of Vietnam. And that's what he believes. And Bazanko really admires Ellsberg a lot. But he's always talking a lot of shit about the JFK people, which is a strange thing for a leftist to be that concerned about. It's some sort of odd personality quirk, I think, in him, because even if you're a leftist and you don't buy the assassination literature, then why would you care? So it's odd. But this is they put out all sorts of arguments. Somebody would talk, or the government can't really plan anything like that. But I mean, the magic bullet's obviously a fraud, and they use the threat of nuclear doomsday to get Earl Warren and Senator Russell to greenlight this. There's the evidence of a plot is just overwhelming at this point, and I don't know any person in my personal life who's familiar with it that really believes the lone nut thing. Even Bazanko won't argue about the case. I bet when you were talking with him, he never tried to argue about the magic bullet or anything like that because he just can't.
Yeah, well, I mean, we tried to stick to like the legacy of Kennedy and like how the left should view that, which is complicated as you acknowledge, right? It's not just that he was a savior, and certainly not that he was a socialist. But the thing that I still don't get is like people say, well, you would have to have the like entire agencies would have to know about this. Hundreds of thousands of people would like. Why? I just don't understand why it would need to be all these people. No. You think of the Catholic Church. I brought this example up before, but like they kept that scandal under wraps, molestation, for decades. And it's not like they were telling every single person who was a member of the church that, yes, we're doing this behind closed doors, right? Secrets can be kept. And another thing, while we're still on this, is, there's been another debate similar to this about the efficacy of disclosure. Like, why should we care if it is true? And, I share the skepticism that, like, just the fact of knowing the truth, the CIA disclosing that we've done some assassinations of political leaders, that would necessarily lead to anything on its own. But you think of Watergate, and as all the problems with that official story and the investigation are, that did lead to some political change, right? The political winds did change, and I think on the left we have to be ready to exploit that if it comes about. If disclosure were to happen, that presents, I think, an opportunity to challenge the legitimacy of institutions like the CIA.
When I think of these issues and about the benefit of disclosure, one of the things I think of is, well, okay, we're out here trying to disclose these things. What are they doing? They're trying to make sure that they're not disclosed. On the 50th anniversary, they turned out a whole lot of propaganda on this, really terrible material, even though the assassination is an interesting subject to people. Oliver Stone took a movie, historical fiction, or a dramatized account of a historical event, the Garrison investigation into the Kennedy assassination, and it was a huge success. So there's a lot of reason to believe that this is a subject that interests the American public and that they would like to learn about the sort of critical research, but they didn't put any of that out. It's like the marketplace and the other, the quest for like views and eyeballs and so on gets set aside. That to me is noteworthy. So the state is worried about this. They put out propaganda. They leave money. The corporate media leaves money on the table rather than actually putting out content that promotes awareness of this. That to me is noteworthy. They have people, in order to respond to these things and put out terrible propaganda pieces, like Phil Shinnon at the New York Times puts this stuff out, or Tim Weiner at Rolling Stone is another one of those CIA-friendly authors.
Oh, he sucks. I've read 2 of his books. They were terrible.
Yeah, his CIA books, which are his book, Legacy Ashes, is sort of useful because it contains facts that cannot be disputed, but that's his whole role, is to basically compile these things and then spin them in the way that's the most favorable to the agency. It's just classic limited hangout stuff. But in order to police this, they have to have people who are tasked with this job of doing this. I mean, to me, it shows that they actually do care about it. And so when I see something like that, I think, well, then we should keep doing it. No, it's not. They're not likely to ever admit it under these circumstances. But potentially, what really allows the U.S. to create this phony universe that people inhabit, this mental space, this fictitious gaslit reality, is the empire, the massive amounts of economic power that is bequeathed to the American empire by virtue of its hegemony over the global capitalist system. And so they have all the power in the world. But as the empire starts to crumble, which we are seeing now, I think that the ability to disguise the empire is also going to decline. And that's why we're seeing all this censorship and other stuff. This is why they still freak out about conspiracy theories all the time, even though it doesn't make any sense, because half the time they're castigating people for conspiracy theories, and then the other half they're formulating their own really stupid conspiracy theories about like Russia, Facebook ads deciding the 2016 election. So it's the whole. I think to me the whole thing is just crumbling now. And when they put out propaganda that's like, lone nut JFK propaganda, then I think, okay, well, it's actually shows that that's important. When they say we don't, like the Gray Zone articles recently on how they don't want an anti-imperialist identity to start to form. Well, then I think that that's what we need to have form and create. That's how people should want to identify, not by these other issues that they don't really give a shit about one way or the other. Like at this point, they don't care about our gender or sexual identity. I mean, I'm talking about the people really running things. Like, they don't care about that. They'd love for us to just be fixated on this stuff. Whereas we really should see it as a 99% versus 1%, or just let's be anti-imperialist. Let's talk about capitalist imperialism. And those two terms are basically inseparable. There's no capitalism that hasn't been imperialist. And so let's talk about it and make that the focus of things, not the bad guys in other countries that we want to obsess about, not other cultural issues and so on. Like this criminal enterprise that is running things here, that's what we should focus on and seek to delegitimize. And then internationally, dialectically, other forces are coming to bear. And if the U.S. doesn't blow everything up, I think that there's a good chance you could really see some interesting changes in the U.S. and U.S. culture, and maybe we'll start to deal with our own history.
It's a very interesting time that we're in right now with the sunset of the American century kind of happening all around our ears all the time. And I was wondering, I don't know, maybe if Andrews was going to get to this, are there any predictions you could make about the current standing of the U.S. on the world stage? Like we're currently in the middle of the Ukraine, Russia, NATO proxy war kind of thing playing out in front of our eyes, where everyone's got their fingers crossed that doesn't like turn into World War III in front of us. There's been a lot of stuff in the news about new pressures between Taiwan and China that kind of seem like, hey, get ready for this. Get ready to talk about this for a while. Do you have any predictions about something we can look forward to in the coming years?
Well, I hope you've got a bomb shelter. No, I don't. Actually, that's not the case. I don't think it's going to help.
I plan to die during the blast, personally.
I mean, that would be better. That's what one of the people said, I think in the Kennedy administration, or maybe it was Eisenhower. One of them said the dead will envy, the living will envy the dead. You're better off dying.
I already do, actually.
Very goth.
Personal,
yeah.
though.
I mean, but it's true. So one possibility is nuclear war, and this is something that people should absolutely take seriously. I've never been so disgusted with the Democratic Party as I am today, and that's really saying something. As a guy who grew up Democrat, even worked for the Obama campaign, which really radicalized me when I saw, he's not going to go after the criminals of the Bush administration. That must mean that this entire regime is criminal. I mean, that's more or less the conclusion I arrived at, and that required me to change trajectory. But so the reason the nuclear war thing is such a huge risk, you're thinking any rational person would say, like, well, wait, Ukraine's on the other side of the world. It can't possibly be a threat to the United States to risk nuclear war over. The issue is that the conflict and Russia's ability to act as a sovereign state on the world stage is a threat to the U.S. empire. Russia stopped the dirty war in Syria, pretty much. I mean, they forced the U.S. to basically engage in outright piracy and gangsterism by occupying a part of Syria and stealing their oil. Because the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, venture that the U.S. backed, in all likelihood, failed, and so thanks in part to Russian help. So Russia is a big threat to the United States empire, but not to the U.S. nation state. But the U.S. can't say that. Russia perceives the war in Ukraine and weaponized Ukraine country against it as an existential threat for logical reasons that are geopolitical. It's not like Ukraine has all this oil and that Russia invaded just to steal its resource wealth. It's like strategically enormously important to Russia, and for it to be controlled by a hostile U.S. force is extremely threatening to Russia. This is well understood by everybody, and so this is why the conflict there is, the stakes are so high. But for the U.S., it's not just that the empire makes all these guys really rich and so on. It's part of what I was saying earlier, that by virtue of the amount of money and power they control and how it allows them to own so much media and everything else that inhibits or that shapes the sense making of people around the world, if the empire falls, then the ability to maintain the hologram of the U.S. empire as a good, lawful, wonderful, freedom-loving place is gonna disappear. And these people have a lot of crimes that they don't want to ever really have to answer for. And so it gives them an incentive to perhaps really engage in some brinksmanship that could make world war, a nuclear world war much more likely. So it's very worrisome. And the fact that the Democrats are not standing up to this is terrifying. I mean, it's just terrifying. I'm kind of through being angry with them because I basically understand how it works. And it's more just like just disgust and sorrow and fear because the empire, not that many people really grasp how sinister this thing is at the top. I think you just don't get rewarded by thinking along these lines. And so is the inertia of all this going to propel us towards doomsday? Now, if it doesn't, then a lot of things may change. I think that a multipolar world seems to be emerging, and the real area where that's a swing in the long run is the global south. The U.S. may not be able to use the IMF anymore, and the fact that all debts are denominated in dollars, such that other countries have to always earn dollars and do business in dollars. China offers a potential alternative to that, which the U.S. has always tried to crush, alternatives to being under U.S. hegemony. They want to stop that. I mean, this is the threat with China. If anybody who looks at it honestly is like, wait, why is China this huge threat? Are they attacking countries? Are they overthrowing governments? Are they sabotaging us? Are they, backing terrorists? No, it's just that they are an economic powerhouse that could potentially compete with the U.S. and give other countries better deals. That's what it comes down to. And it's really obvious, but they'll never formulate it that way. But in the global south, the U.S. is running out of the ability to determine events. I mean, Bolsonaro, I think part of the reason they didn't really go after Bolsonaro is it would just made the U.S. look so bad. We'll see how things play out. And they could go either way. But I mean, the Bolivia thing crapped out. Also, the coup there, this regime change thing in Iran doesn't seem to be going anywhere. They really want something in Taiwan, but what they want and what could happen that would be good for anyone is hard to even figure out. I feel like the empire is dumber than I've ever seen it. And but it all comes from the fact that what they want is insane. They want to control the world forever and have everybody accept that this rules-based international order is some worthy thing that they should defend and not just a dictatorship of corporate America over all of humanity. It's amazing to watch and exciting as it seems to be is spiraling out of, downward, but also worrisome because they've got a lot of nukes.
Well, yeah, that's the thing to remember is that this is a massive system and it's complicated. When people say, the government and the empire, it's very incompetent. That's true in many respects. In other respects, it's not true. There's things they're competent at. There's things they're incompetent at. There's like all kinds of different contradictions and different operators in this same behemoth pushing us towards oblivion. But as we're closing out, there's so much that we could touch on. There's Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. But I do want to make sure to ask about this, which you touch on a little bit in the book, which is the 1990s, which I find to be a fascinating time for several reasons, but one of which is it's this very brief blip between the Cold War and the War on Terror, where we're kind of out of enemies for just a little bit. We're trying to scrounge some up here and there, but Clinton comes into office in 92, and he's on the right wing of the Democratic Party, right? He's never been a progressive, but he was in sort of this milieu with people like Gary Hart, who were terrible on economics, but did actually want some reforms of the intelligence agencies. So when he gets into office, there has been some, sort of vague promises and things about, changing Cold War policies and having a saner approach to international affairs and intelligence gathering. What do you think happened there? Because, obviously none of that stuff really got overhauled in any meaningful way whatsoever. And of course, by 2001, it was all, worse than it ever had been prior. What do you think happened with Clinton? And also, you have a blurb in your book from Oliver Stone. What can we do to get him to make a Clinton movie, a Slick Willie movie? Can we pitch that to him? I'll try to write the screenplay. Are we going to get this maybe about both the Clintons? I think that'd be a pretty good picture.
Only 90s kids will remember this, by the way.
Yeah, that idea. I don't even know how to think about what an Oliver Stone Clinton movie would look like, because it'd be hard to figure out what to focus on. It was such a weird time. I think that I'll try to explain Clinton in a way that gives him some more continuity than he might otherwise. So, and I'm going to trace this right back to Watergate, but I'm not going to go into the weeds on Watergate. So, Watergate, Nixon's the last liberal president, and for a number of reasons, Nixon is swept aside. And so the way that the new monetary system gets implemented is not along lines that were kind of protectionist and vaguely liberal, but it really, getting rid of Nixon basically ushers in neoliberalism. Deregulation starts under Gerald Ford, who was parachuted in. He never won even the vice presidency. The most notable thing he'd done was help cover up the JFK assassination. All of a sudden, he's president, never elected to vice president or president. And then Jimmy Carter is handpicked by David Rockefeller, and he's also neoliberal, more deregulation and so on, but a Democrat with some connections to labor. It's not really till Reagan that you get like the final form of the American president, which is what we've gotten every president since is basically Reagan, is 90% Reagan and then 10% some other, nutty thing. But once this dollar regime is consolidated under Reagan, after the debt crises, the oil shocks, and all these, I explain how all these things factor into this sort of rolling conspiracy to establish this Rumpelstiltskin dollar that Reagan gets, which is unconnected to gold or anything else. And by a few years into Reagan's administration, it's totally established, and you have these debt crises in other countries, but they're all in dollar denominated, debts. And this allows the IMF and so on to really stick it to these countries. And that continues under Clinton. Now, foreign policy wise, Reagan and the CIA and other people, they did things to bring down the Soviet Union. They gave loans to Eastern Bloc countries, which were exacerbated by interest rates. They helped to collapse the oil prices that Gorbachev was wanting to use to reform the Soviet Union. They did all these things to bring down the Soviet Union. That was basically rollback, this more aggressive foreign policy, and it brings down the Soviet Union. And then the next president that you have in after that is Bill Clinton. And the policy of the U.S. is supposedly this like one world, end of history, neoliberal democracy time. But really, if you look at the national security state, it's very covert what's happening. But you have essentially the Cold War is just still going on. It's just they're expanding NATO, which Clinton promised he wouldn't do, or other leaders promised they wouldn't do, but Clinton, goes back on that. They're also sending out jihadis, terrorists, all throughout the 90s in places besides Afghanistan, because that war's over, but they're sending them all over the former Soviet Union to establish beachheads in different ways to intervene in ways that help the U.S. empire. So these jihadis go into Azerbaijan and set up a drug running operation there and a coup that puts in a U.S. puppet. They're active in Libya. Al-Qaeda tries to assassinate Gaddafi in the late 90s. They're active in Bosnia, like the blind sheikh who tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993 and had a bunch of other landmarks he was going to bomb. Eventually goes to jail, right? But he was involved in the Bosnia jihad. Also, breaking up Yugoslavia. In Kosovo, you have Al-Qaeda there working with the terrorist KLA, basically on the same side as the U.S. This is in 1998, 1999. And the Al-Qaeda guy on the ground there is Mohammed al-Zawahiri, the brother of Ayman al-Zawahiri. So you have this, what I call the McJihad period, where, which, you could take up to the present day, but this is like after Afghanistan, all these guys are used in the 90s, and then it's not admitted that this is a part of U.S. foreign policy. Instead, it's like, we need to intervene in Yugoslavia because look at what's happening here, all this violence. But it's like the U.S. is fanning this. They want to break up Yugoslavia. Chechnya, there's this civil war, and Russia's so brutal against these guys. But, as if you've seen the Putin interviews, Putin asks George Bush, he tells Oliver Stone this, he says, why are you supporting these jihadis in Chechnya? And Bush is like, I don't really know about that. That's troubling to me. But, they're using these guys. And if you look at the war on terror, it basically allows for the same sort of thing. It's they rolled back communism, and then they just kept pushing NATO that way. And then you go a little further south into Central Asia and the Middle East, and it's also like they're advancing that way, but with in a covert way, with like jihadis and so on and so forth. So it really is an attempt to keep fighting the Cold War, even though it's supposedly over. And Russia sees this. They attack Russia with economic reforms and shock therapy and so on, and they really immiserate Russia. It's not until 2007 or so that like Putin finally says we don't like this. We don't want this. We want to be able to exist peacefully and have our security considerations taken care of. And he throws down the gauntlet kind of with the U.S. But the U.S. can't tolerate this. But those Clinton years are an important period for understanding how the U.S. was really prosecuting the Cold War by other means. And then that same kind of agenda takes off with the 9/11 wars. And then that dies down because they kind of fail. But the whole agenda gets picked back up under Obama with the Arab Spring Wars, Libya and Syria. And then they fail there too. And now the last place left, it seems that where they can sort of poke around the perimeter of Russia and China, as like the Cold War never ended, are places that were Cold War hotspots, which is Ukraine and Taiwan. And so this whole time period can be understood in terms of, the last 80 years is really just the U.S. empire versus the rest of the world. And it looks like the U.S. empire is not going to actually prevail over the rest of the world.
Ohio versus everybody.
Yeah, well, that I guess it brings me to my last question. It can be very daunting and despondency-inducing to think about the sheer amount of power that these people have. But there's hope around the world, thankfully. But what can we do in the United States as anti-imperialists, as people who take up that identity unapologetically? What are some practical things that people can do to sort of try and end this insane global order?
Well, I think in a way, putting yourself in the right frame of mind to where you can accept the things that you cannot change, and try to change the things you can change, like that sort of detachment, almost like a Buddhist sort of sensibility.
It's also something they say in AA.
I know, but look, this is you will lose your mind if you really start to think of like, okay, there's this problem and I need to solve it, because there are things that are more powerful than us and our ability to deal with these issues. Take a little bit of solace in the fact that dialectically, internationally, the forces that are going to be the empire's undoing are already in action. Okay, so that's part of what is happening. It's not incumbent upon us to try to do it from within. I don't really think that it can be done from within. I think the hegemony of this whole regime is too much to really think like we're just going to explain people the truth and then that's going to somehow turn it around. Other things have to happen internationally, but really embracing being anti-imperialist and also recognizing the chicanery and the dishonest, sort of sinister way that the U.S. never acknowledges its empire. They don't want it to be an argument of, do you like the U.S. empire or not? It's like always this focus on these different enemies. It's always them. That's why they call people tankies. You're like, you're an anti-imperialist, you're against the U.S. Army. Well, they don't want to call you an anti-imperialist. They want to call you a tanky, which is a reference, I guess, to the fact that countries that the U.S. doesn't like have tanks or something. I mean, these people are idiots, but it doesn't matter. There's actually something important that we can learn from this, which is they don't want to even defend the empire, and they are aggressive. They'll resort to childish name calling if you actually try to be an anti-imperialist and keep the focus on the U.S. empire. So that's what we need to do. We need to identify as anti-imperialists and persuade people that this is the way to be, and to talk to people to the extent that we can about the reality of the U.S. empire and what this regime is, and hope that we can eventually get more people on our side, because this empire is it's the greatest enemy, I believe, that humanity has really ever faced. And it's also the reason why everything in America sucks, that we don't try to create a society where people can like see a doctor easily, go to get an education easily, have housing easily. That's on purpose. Like, they want to keep us in this state because it's easier to manage people that are kind of desperate and don't have any bargaining power over their lives. So these things are all connected. And that's something else we should emphasize, that this system is not, we don't really benefit from it. In fact, it's giving us kind of a scary dystopian future if we don't change it. And so it's actually in everybody's self-interest to try to change this as soon as we have the chance.
Yeah.
I actually have one last question. And you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but can you tell us about this Zonky rap we were talking about earlier?
The rap you made for Barack Obama personally.
Yeah, well, this is a kind of a strange tale, and I worked for Barack Obama, which I was good in terms of like organizational things and people skills. It was a great thing to do for a number of reasons, even though it was miserable and they really exploited me to no end. But there were weird parts about it, and one of them was we went to a big retreat, sort of close to the end, and they made us do this sort of variety show, and we had to like either sing or something. And so we did a rap. And somehow in the office, it became a thing where we really wanted to get a zonky for like campaign purposes. We thought it would help us if we had some balloons and a zonky, which is a zebra.
What is a zonky?
When you cross a zebra and a donkey.
Like a
Cross
liger,
a
but
zebra
with
and a
the,
donkey.
okay, gotcha.
I thought it was
We've
like a
all-
slur.
We've all done a little bit of animal husbandry, some
Whom
Sure.
conventional and
Like a
so on.
liger.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And and there was a part of our region was divided up, and it was called the slice, right? Because that was it was sort of a slice of Missouri, like the way that it was shaped on the map. And so we were kind of, I think, stupefied by doing too much work. And the clever rap song that we came up with was to the tune of Ice Ice Baby, except it was Slice, Slice, Zonky. And there was a chorus to it. And we were all kind of rapping and standing around with a microphone. And there were verses, but I cannot remember them. All I remember really is Slice, Slice, Zonky, which did not become that earworm that everybody was singing back in 2008, but maybe it should have. So if anybody out there was OFA 2008 and they have the copy of the lyrics to Slice Slice Zonky, I'd like to hear them.
Man.
If you have the live
But
studio
confidentially,
recording,
please do not post them. Do not post them in a public forum.
it's very funny to me. Your memory of this is entirely. I recall the roar of the crowd as Slice Slice Zonky was belted out.
Slice Slice Zonkey's been covered up by the deep state for obvious reasons.
There was a roar from the crowd, and it was not applause.
Is everyone singing Yes We Can?
Yes,
Remember
we
that Will
can.
I Am? Yes We Can.
Yeah, the Obama years were crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, people loved stuff like that back then.
Well,
Yeah, it was optimistic. There was optimism after the Bush thing. But at least I snapped out of it after Honduras and the bailouts, and especially with Libya. I was like, man, I'm not that much of a sucker.
I'm never writing a rap again.
I wrote Slice Slice Zonky for you, you son of a bitch. I wanted to say, but that's a weak diss power.
well, Aaron Good, where can people find your not limited to your perhaps more rap bars, but your other work? Where can people find that?
The book you can buy wherever you buy books. It is American Exception, Empire in the Deep State. And the main way people can follow most of the work I'm putting out is the podcast on Patreon. I have a lot of material on these issues. Like we have a whole lot of JFK episodes on Indonesia, Peter Del Scott oral history series. We're doing a long history on my book with Ben Norton, and it actually goes into a lot of history that I didn't even put in the book, but felt was important. So we have a lot of material there. And I've done that in lieu of getting an academic appointment because I think I'm too radical. I'm pretty sure of that. And so until things change, the podcast has allowed me to be able to support myself, and it's been a lot of fun. So I recommend people check that out. And there's also AmericanException.com where we do post some articles by me and by article by Peter Del Scott and some other interesting material that you can find there.
All right. Well, oh crap! I forgot to ask about Wellstone. We'll do that next time.
Another
I think they killed him, but I probably don't know that. I'm not an expert on this one. I just am pretty sure they killed him.
Okay.
That's a good short answer.
Spoiler alert.
They killed his ass.
Yeah, they got him.
We need someone who's not a Holocaust denier to investigate that one. But,
Full episode on Wellstone on the Patreon. By the
yeah,
way.
you can check that out. But Aaron, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Wow. Holy shit. I feel smarter now. My brain is full of information about American Empire.
My white ass is tired for sitting down and listening so much.
Yeah.
Well, it's time to instead plug our various projects at the end of the podcast, everyone's favorite part. I'm going to go first. here I go. I have a show November 18th at Caveat Theater in the Lower East Side of Manhattan Town. You should come. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's called Game Boys, and sure would love it if you came on down to that. That's every month, but the next one is November 18th, a stand-up comedy show in the south part of Manhattan, baby, and that's my plug.
Anders, you got anything?
I got anderslee.substack.com, which includes an article that was also reposted by Racket, which is a Twin Cities website that I wrote about Paul Wellstone, who we briefly just mentioned.
Cool.
Yeah, also come out to Botanical Comedy November 19th, 9 p.m. at Misfit Kava in Bushwick. And, of course, you can find me on socials for now, at Anders Lee here on Twitter. And Dursley1 on Instagram.
Before the state shuts him down.
That's right.
I would like to announce that I just quit working at a Psychobilly restaurant, which means I freed up some time in my schedule, and I will be returning to the world of stand-up comedy. So if you live in New York City, keep an eye out. I usually put my stuff on my pinned tweet if I've got spots around town and stuff. I'll be popping up here and there. And I'm also going on tour in January with my old pal, Mishka Shubali. We are going through the South with a golden fiddle or something. Yep, Jackass.
Jake Ass.
Jake Ass. That's a good name for the tour. We're playing Memphis with my pals, speed punk duo Heels out of Memphis, who has planned some sort of show. I don't know the details of much yet, but it's on J6 and it's called Heel Surrection. So they asked me to do it, and I was like, book me a bus, motherfucker. That sounds like a lot of fun. And yeah, we'll be going through the South, down to Texas, the whole usual run of spots. If you are someone who's come out to see us before, I'm looking to book a show in Columbus, Ohio on January 4th still. So if you're in that part of the country and you may be able to get us a show together, hit me up because it's DIY, fucker. This is how we book it.
Fucker.
This is how we book it.
Yeah.
In Columbus.
The same thing happened in my head when I said that. All right.
This is how we book it.
I'm back, and listen to my other show, Why You Mad, and that's it. These are plugs, and have yourself a wonderful, I don't know what time of day it is. You can't say that at the end of a podcast. It's finished.
Finished.